Hello, I'm Benedict Beckeld. University curricula nowadays have changed to become more inclusive, and they are rejecting much of the core Western knowledge and literature that have been synonymous with education for centuries. It has become common among the Western intelligentsia to argue along the lines that the West is only a mental construct and that therefore the humanities should be made more diverse. A salient quote I came across a while ago by a very reputed scholar, and which is very typical, is this: they, people like me I suppose, presume the very existence of the West. They take Western civilization as a fact rather than a construct, and as the correct starting point for all educational endeavors. This quote betrays how intellectually cheap our intelligentsia have in fact become, as they miss a very important point here. Now, in order to explain this, we first need some philosophical background. In philosophy, there has often been a distinction between realism and nominalism. Realism, which essentially goes back to Plato, states that concepts have a real, separate existence, whereas nominalists believe that concepts don't have real existence, but are only the names, hence nominalism, that we give to physical material phenomena. This is related to what in philosophy is called the problem of universals, but for the purposes of this video, we can stick with the terms realism and nominalism. Now, I myself happen to be a nominalist. That is to say, I believe that only physical things exist, and that concepts and universals are only words. In the history of philosophy, nominalism has often gained the upper hand, I think rightly, but in the philosophy of the last half century or so, this has led to an overreach and to an abuse of nominalism for very destructive ends. The abusers of nominalism feel that since concepts are but linguistic constructs, they have little or no claim to truth. They basically hold that the rejection of stable signifiers, words, entails the rejection of phenomena. If words are merely constructs of convention or signs, then the phenomena to which the words refer must be treated with suspicion, and the signs must be decoded, revealing the dishonesty of the society that instituted them. Foucault basically got tenure by repeating this ad nauseum. Now, I actually don't dislike Foucault, by the way, but he got this sort of thing wrong all the time. Now, whereas it is true that the real world and the language used to describe it are two separate realms, this abuse holds that because language constructs new meanings, we cannot properly rely on the reality of the things to which language refers. But against this abuse of nominalism, we can say that the things are still real in spite of language's instability. If I say that love is only a word, as indeed it is, it does not follow that the physical phenomena for which love serves as a shorthand, like heart palpitations and warmth, are not real and important. So whereas I can say with some legitimacy that love does not exist, because it is only a word under which an enormous palette of the most diverse phenomena is subsumed, the things to which we can plausibly refer when we say love do exist. And so, for instance, if I say that this hand is real in the sense that the West is not, what I am stating is true, but it is a trivial truth. That the West is a construct and not a real physical thing is obvious, but our intelligentsia forget that the concept exists because the physical particulars exist. So by rejecting the concepts as mere constructs and therefore devoid of reality, they abuse nominalism and forget that concepts, even though they do not have real, that is physical existence, nonetheless contain meaning by dint of their physical particulars. And so if the West can be said to merely be a geographic location, for instance, those who say this are guilty of a sort of reductionism that robs the world of meaning. One sees this in action all the time. If we look at sex, for instance, sex is primarily biology, a union of sexual organs. Kant, in his Metaphysics of Morals, infamously describes marriage as merely a pact for the reciprocal use of the genitals. I'm not putting a picture for that one, by the way, and it probably shouldn't surprise anyone that Kant died a bachelor. With this reductionist attitude, something like sex becomes unremarkable and cheap, a fact which of course constantly plays itself out in our society. But the meaning of sex is what, for instance, the arts can illustrate in the form of poetry, music, painting, sculpture, and the like, and what we ourselves, if we are lucky, can perceive in the act of union, that is to say, what sex can actually mean: care, tenderness, a desire for the other person's happiness, in a word, love. Now, this is a construct, to be sure, but it is nonetheless based on real and meaningful particulars. So the abuse of nominalism leads to a debasement of some of the world's most wonderful things. This affliction stems to a considerable extent from the French postmodernists of the previous century. I mentioned Foucault earlier, gathered mainly around the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, whose attitude it often was to dismiss grand concepts as devoid of meaning, since they were all invented and based on the interests of a particular group. They might say that the West is a Eurocentric supremacy claim, for instance, or they might say that, for example, justice simply represents the interest of the rich in protecting their own property from theft. But they forget that even if this might be true to some extent, justice can still be just. That is, something can be more than one thing. Now, one of the central tasks for philosophy in the 21st century should be to resist this reductionism and this abuse of nominalism. That is, it should be to undo the damage of the 20th century. Another typical statement by our intelligentsia in the context of the West is this: the concept of Western civilization is premised on a clear distinction between the West and everyone else, a distinction that is clear to no one but those ideologues who insist upon it. If we accept the notion of Western civilization with a straight face, we must acknowledge that this puts us not necessarily on the same footing as Eurocentric white nationalists claiming Greco-Roman antiquity as their past, but certainly on the same spectrum. I cannot tell you how common this attitude is in academia. So this is what I said before. The nominalism abusers think that the West is just a selfish construct with pernicious purposes. I myself, incidentally, in the course of far-left academic suppression of my work, have been similarly attacked. This quote, of course, that I just read is rubbish and another example of the abuse of nominalism. The fact of the matter is that there are certain ideas that have developed over time, and these ideas, these universals, though they only exist in our minds, help explain the particulars which do exist in the real world. And the scholar who wrote this quote is also ignorant, because the existence of the West in this sense is fully recognized by many people outside of the West in the developing world, certainly no racist Western ideologues, who do see these distinctions, who recognize the universals, and who want to partake in the particulars. Justice does not exist. That is true. But just actions and just institutions do exist, and the West has been better at developing those institutions than has any other civilization in history. If we think that, for example, Shakespeare and automobiles cannot fit within one concept, namely the West, we would also have to say that two human beings having sex and a bird looking for a worm to feed to its young cannot fit within another concept, namely love. But these concepts, though indeed they are but mental abstractions and ideas, are still useful as we seek to make sense of the world. And this is when we realize that the West cannot so easily be dismissed as a construct. The West is democratic debate. The West is ballot boxes. The West is scientific skepticism. The West is the Parthenon and the skyscraper. The West is this violin and these books behind me. And the West is the Judeo-Christian integrity of the individual. Again, I'm Benedict Beckeld, and thank you so much for watching. Oh, and if you do enjoy this sort of content, please feel free to like and or subscribe. Thank you.